like a carpenter. But okay, everybody, welcome to the second Salon of the Protocol Symposium. This is ARC Regenerative Communities with Kaliya and Day, and they'll be talking about what makes the IETF special and what allows it to regenerate over time and what protocols it uses to extend itself into the future and what everybody can take away from that. So without further ado, I'll pass it off to you guys. I'll stop sharing here.
Okay. So I'm Kaliya Young, and Day is also here, and we're going to share our research from this summer looking at the remarkable regenerative patterns and practices of the Internet Engineering Task Force. So to start off with, it's important that we remember that all societies are technical. They've been building tools since the beginning. In fact, our ancestors that are animals, they also use tools, and that tooling is social in that we are building tools, and there's kind of a recursive loop between technology, our social interactions, and our societies. And arguably the internet is one of the most consequential technologies ever built. And when we look at standards and protocols, the recipes for technology are co-created in standards development organizations that define the protocols. And if code is law, the coders who follow protocols when they code, then the SDOs that define protocols are in effect legislative bodies. And then we need to look at if these are what are the legislative processes or the protocols within those legislative bodies for the creation of protocols that coders ultimately follow. So the internet is perhaps the ultimate digital public infrastructure and is an active digital commons. And the IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force, and its antecedents wrote the protocol that made the internet. Its protocol, TCP/IP, won a protocol war in the early 90s versus a competing set of protocols called OSI, Open Systems Interoperability, developed by traditional SDOs, in particular the International Telecommunications Union and International Standards Organization. And this protocol war happened before the World Wide Web. So most people don't even know about it or what that choice means for what technology we have today. And the IETF's regenerative value-driven approach to protocol creation and supporting the systems for protocol creation is not a limitation, but in fact, it's a necessary condition for maintaining a true, open, and innovative internet ecosystem. So what we got a chance to examine is sort of dive deep into understanding how the IETF works and how these values are lived and what their values are and how they're lived in practice. And we think that this work is particularly relevant for pro-social technical communities because we map out the social DNA, clarify all the organelles within the IETF and how they function. And we hope that this work can shed light on key patterns and processes needed to maintain and grow digital and physical commons. So I'll turn it over to you, Day, for the next few slides.
Okay. Yeah, so we did, basically we had this brilliant kind of sticky wall experience where we had put some of the structures, some of the events, and some of our observations in the research, stick them all up on the wall, and then had identified which patterns in these different pattern languages map to that. And when we started moving things around and grouping them. And that's where we realized that there were essentially these groups, and these groups, then we saw that they kind of flowed into one another in a supportive way, where, so basically that one of the core things was their epistemology, or their theory of knowledge, and fundamentally was the idea that the knowledge is emergent and relational, and their core identity story, which was really about this kind of nothing about us without us, this story that an internet by engineers needed to be governed by engineers, then ramifies out into this culture where they're really embodying that in their processes, in their governance, and in their tooling. And then we'll see later that the tooling that they created really supports this process of emergent and relational knowledge. So I know that it's usually yeah, you skipped, but it's usually a violation of slide protocol to read text that's on the slide that you have up, but I'm actually just going to do this anyway because I feel like it's so important. The internet is not values neutral, and neither is the IETF. We want the internet to be useful for communities that share our commitment to openness and fairness. We embrace technical concepts such as decentralized control, edge user empowerment, and sharing of resources because those concepts resonate with the core values of the IETF community. These concepts have little to do with technology that's possible and much to do with the technology we choose to create. And I think this is the reason I give it extra emphasis there is just because I don't think a lot of people think about the IETF as being a values-based organization, and it really is at the core of the identity and informs everything else about their process. Oh, sorry, I was trying to hit down arrow to go to the next one. So you see that this was actually, from the very beginning, the RFC1 was about this, what was then called the host software, and RFC2 was essentially the first round of comments. It was comments on RFC1, basically, further discussion of this host software. But then immediately in RFC3, we get a discussion of the process. It was a discussion of the notes themselves, and essentially trying to be very, very clear that what they wanted to do was to invite this ongoing open conversation. Really what is embodied in these three letters. The request for comments is like to be taken very seriously. That they're not wanting the things themselves to be authoritative, but for there to be like an emergent confidence in what they're doing that comes through that openness and being subjected to ongoing discussion. So this is a slide that you probably can't read all of the very, very fine print on here, but essentially what's going on is that they have all of these very well integrated tools that support both the asynchronous processes, all of the mailing lists, the discussion. It's a support infrastructure for the working groups. It then supports both the preparation for the in-person meetings, which is like all the submissions of all of the materials and so on, so that everything is available during the in-person meetings. And then all of that is, if you were to zoom in, you see the little colored icons next to every line item in this data tracker slide is all going to all of the different resources that there are for every single meeting that's happening there. So every single one is going to have slides, it's going to have recordings, it's going to have the remote engagement interface that you would go to if you were not able to be there physically. And then that entire remote interface ends up getting recorded so that you can see, essentially, a virtual version of how it all went down with the slides, the speaker camera, the room camera, the remote participants, and how the chat unfolded in real time, and then that's all folded into the permanent record, so it's not ephemeral, and that means that the transparency is, yes, is almost entire. you know, you can see, and then in fact there were, obviously they didn't have all these tools before there was an internet because they were busy, trying to build the internet, and a lot of it actually happened on paper. And they've since gone back in and gotten all of these old archives and digitized them, and have then added that, so that now in fact like the full record is actually all in here. If you're in a in-person meeting, you can orient with the floor plans, so you can find the room that you're supposed to be in and all of that. It's all linked to the meetings, and then you can also orient digitally to the materials for the meeting and the working groups around those meetings, and who the people are, who are the, what area is it in, and all of the documentation. So it's all woven in together in a really brilliant way. We were super impressed.
Yeah. Great.
So yeah, I mean, this is really the core thesis, is that the IETF is a regenerative community, that it's constituted by all of these different regenerative governance patterns. And at one point we were considering, perhaps we're still considering, titling the thing "Sequencing the Social DNA of the IETF." So really, it is, we see it as being regenerative through having these patterns, and specifically this regenerative lens image was taken from an essay, The Regenerative Lens, which gives this definition of regeneration, that regenerative systems maintain positive reinforcing cycles of well-being within and beyond themselves. And we saw that demonstrated time and time again. We are right now here in this very call benefiting from some well-being that has ramified out through this stewarding of the IETF. You want to take over at the Cynefin? That's cool. Yeah.
I can talk about Cynefin. So the internet is complex, and the IETF holds this complexity well. We reference this framework in our paper that we will share a link with you all to view by the end of this. That because the internet is complex and you cannot know what it will do when you change it, you can only probe, sense, and respond. The whole IETF process is designed to support that kind of practice, where people put out an internet draft, they see how it works when it's instantiated code, and then they iterate on that until they think it's done, and like move it through the process to become a final RFC. We used for this research 3 different pattern languages as sources of regenerative patterns. So how do you know if something's regenerative? These are good tools to look at. The group work stack focuses on the aliveness in meetings. So we found the meetings themselves very alive. The meetings and the practices in the overall IETF support a wise democracy. And we also used a pattern language that's in a book form, focused on social permaculture, that had some critical patterns that we'll reference specifically coming up, about how they are in practicing patterns that are related to autonomy, joyful work, and really getting at how they organize themselves in ways that are in alignment with deeper traditions than are found in contemporary organizational forms for the most part. This is a slide just in case you're like, what the heck's a pattern language? There's a whole history of them coming out of architecture. And this is a diagram sort of looking at sort of patterns as a practice, and looking at where do patterns come from. So at least the group work stack and the wise democracy pattern language both did an extensive period of pattern mining, where they worked with practitioners in the field to find the patterns. and then they documented them and iterated them. And we're a beneficiary of that. We're tapping into these patterns and using them as a discernment tool relative to the IETF. This is the sticky wall that Day mentioned. You can see culture, knowledge, tooling sort of also written on here because it's got a whiteboard in the background of it. And so this is where that hexagonal loop emerged from in our process. So there was a ton of history in between 1969 and 1992, which will be the next slide. And we do not have time to go into all of it, and we didn't have time to document it in our research. But the important part to understand is that the IETF structure prior to 1991 had a 4-layer hierarchy, with the Internet Architecture Board sitting at the top, sort of being the final approver of standards. And this Internet Architecture Board was led by Vince Cerf and his so-called kitchen cabinet. It was self-appointed and reflected and had many of the early pioneers that had built the ARPANET and the original protocols. But by 1991, the internet was growing really rapidly, and it was starting to become more disconnected from the engineers doing the day-to-day work of building the protocols. And you can see at the bottom are the working groups, which are circles where anybody can participate, area directors who are all together in the Internet Engineering Steering Group, and then the IB. And what happened in 1991 is the Internet Architecture Board decided that with government funding going away for the ARPANET and NSFNet, that they needed to create a organizational home for the work, and they founded the Internet Society. And the Internet Society had its first meeting in June of 1992 in Kobe, Japan. And what happened in that meeting was they made allusions to the future direction of the protocols to moving towards the OSI model. And this communication coming from the IAB at their first meeting in their new organization, ISOC, put the IETF into a tizzy. And in their July meeting, this slide was presented as part of a presentation by David Clark in the plenary. And many people will say this very last line of this slide, rough consensus and running code. And this is the original context in the context of this phrase at the bottom. We reject kings, presidents, and voting, and we believe in rough consensus and running code. And it captured the zeitgeist of the organization. And part of this rejection of kings and president was explicitly stating they didn't want to be involved in organizations driven by state interests and where states decided who was allowed to participate in the standards discussions, like happened at OSI and ITUT. And he also articulated this whole set of tensions that were bubbling up in the organization. How do we have an open process and let all voices be heard? But if you have a closed process, you can make progress pretty faster, right? How do we keep up with reality and also have time to think? If we just go with the market-driven forces, the future is commercial, and then how do we scale if the future is the internet? And the other thing that's important on the slide, it says the standards element of yesterday, OSI, specifically referencing this conflict that's like active at the time between like TCP/IP and the OSI protocols. And so in this meeting, the community said, like basically had a rebellion against the IAB and said, you are not the boss of us, and we want to have more say and control over how the organization and ultimately the standards are decided. And as I was reading this history, it became clear that they were sort of doing a not about us without us. They had a not about us without us moment. And this saying I first heard around disability rights movement, but Thankfully, Day did some good research and actually has a history in Eastern European labor movements from like the 1500s. So it's like an old saying, it's not new. And ultimately, the community had like it often does when it has conflicts, it names them like David Clark did, and it convenes a group to figure out how to solve the problem in a transparent way. And it had a working group that met for between the meeting in July and the meeting in November, and they figured out a path forward, and I'm going to describe that next. But this gets at what they also decided, that all subgroups in the IETF and the Internet Society that have a role in the standards process should be either open to anyone, like working groups, or have well-documented restricted membership, which the voting members are elected or nominated through an open process. And they stay true to this today, and they have this quite sophisticated governance mechanisms that we'll walk through. And in this new process, they are sort of saying, we only want consensual hierarchies, that hierarchies are necessary to do this work, but they are not, they have a flexibility and aliveness. There's strong rotation of leadership. Most positions can only be held for 2 years. Power must be earned, and we'll talk about the processes they develop for that. And there's communication throughout all levels of the hierarchy. As Day showed you, the tooling infrastructure is very sophisticated for sharing almost all information with anybody who wants to look at it. So I shared a little bit about how the Internet Architecture Board pre-1991 was the decider. It is no longer the decider. They changed the role of the Internet Architecture Board to be future looking, to hold the work of the IETF in relationship to the rest of the world. So they are the body that appoints liaisons to work with other entities, that sends people to different conferences to share what the IETF does. They're kind of the entry point for other institutions to interact with the IETF. And it's expected to pay an attention to important long-term issues, and will host individual workshops and in-depth reviews of particular architectural reviews. So coming up this fall, they're hosting a workshop on AI, for example. And they also put on programs around various issues. And they also, as I said, manage, they themselves appoint and manage relationships with a bunch of other organizations, and even internal to the IETF. They appoint the Internet Research Task Force Chair and the Independent Streams Editor. So they have a really important role, but approving standards is not that one of those roles. How are they selected? There are 12 people on the IAB. 6 are chosen each year, so they have 2-year terms, and the nominating committee is the one that chooses who sits on the IAB and in other roles throughout this ecosystem of organelles that make up the IETF. So the NomCom also selects area directors. It chooses people to sit on the 2 legal entities related to the IETF Trust and the IETF LLC. So it has a significant role in picking all of the leadership roles across the consensual hierarchy. And the way that you get into the nominating committee is anyone who's been to 3 out of the last 5 meetings is eligible to raise their hand and say they're willing to be on NomCom. There's a sophisticated process of random number generation that they go through to pick 10 of the people amongst the people who raised their hands. So this last NomCom selection process, there was 164 people who raised their hands and 10 were selected. And those 10 people are representative of the whole. They're selected by random, except you cannot have more than 2 people from the same company on the NomCom. And they deliberate together. They get feedback from the whole body about people who raise their hand and say they want to be on the IAB or they'd like to be the security area director. And they interview those people, and all those people fill out an application. All of these deliberations are secret. They're private to the nomcom, and they're not disclosed to the wider body. And all the feedback to the nomcom about potential candidates is also secret. And these on the slide, these are all wise democracy patterns that are embodied in this process. The other body that has a lot of power within the IETF and does a lot of the work is the Internet Engineering Steering Group. It is made up of the area directors. So each area director, I think there's 6 areas right now. And so there's 2 area directors usually that rotate. So for 2-year terms. And some areas, if they get particularly large, have 3 area directors. Working group chairs are appointed by area directors. And what's the next slide? Yeah. So that's how there is also this hierarchy going on there where you become a working group chair at the invitation of a area director, and you can also be let go. If you're not doing a good job, they will ask you to move on and stop being a chair. There are 125 working groups currently in the IETF. I put this slide here. I think we're going through a lot of different roles and things. How do we know what they do? One of the reasons all of that complexity and that diagram I just shared works is because everything's well documented. I don't think it's all there, but when something is unclear, then the first thing they'll do is like, let's write down what happens now and let's document how a process is working. And so they've done this with specific roles in the organizations and specific institutions in the organization. And it's quite sophisticated. When I first showed up the IETF, I'm like, why do they keep referencing RFCs? Like they sort of get up to the mic and make a comment and they're like, as it says in RFC, da 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 da. Now I understand why, because I've gone into the RFCs and swam around and there's a lot there. Next slide. Okay, now we get to the fun part, the open parts of this process. All of the circles in this diagram are open to anybody in the whole world to join. So you could go join these circles today. Research groups and working groups are the primary organs where most things happen in the IETF. New working groups come into existence after they've written a proposed charter and they have presented to the body of the IETF through the form of birds of a feather. And if it gets approved, it becomes a new working group and put into a particular area. Key patterns that we found in the ongoing work of working groups is possibility thinking. They operate on rough consensus and running code. So rough consensus does not mean everybody agrees. It means all concerns have been addressed and heard and taken seriously, and then progress can be made. Internet drafts can be written by anybody in the whole world. You can go write an internet draft today if you like. It means very little unless a working group has picked up that internet draft and decided to make it a working group draft and decided to collectively work on it together. There's they have incredibly good practices of listening to each other to really understand what is happening in the work and where issues may be arising. They ask powerful questions. They do a lot of reflective listening. It's pretty incredible. They mirror each other a lot. So before they state their own opinions, they'll reflect back to the previous speaker in a queue about, did we hear this right? Is this what you were saying? There's shared leadership roles. So an important role that I learned about, I've been going to the IETF for about a year, and there's always new things you're learning. There's a document shatterperd, which someone who, once a working group draft is complete enough and the chairs believe it's ready to go to the IESG for approval, they write up a report about what the draft says. They document also the code that has implemented the draft, because you can't get an RFC approved unless you have 2 instances of working code. And there's a lot of agency and ownership of the process. Like, people are actively engaged in moving the work forward. Oh, backwards, forwards. So with what I've shared, this is a pattern from the social permaculture pattern language. The IETF has built and maintained a zone of autonomy outside of the forces that would have built the internet had they not decided to create it within the zone that they had. So at the beginning, they had US government funding, but they figured out a way to maintain the autonomy they had and fund themselves. And a key quality of the zone of autonomy is voluntariness. So everybody who is playing a role in the IETF has volunteered to be there and isn't being paid by the IETF to do that work. And everybody who's participating in a working group is also voluntarily there. So this raises a question that's really profound. How can an organization that is totally open to participation from anyone in the world maintain its coherence and be effective in its results, developing the protocols for data communications on networks? And one way it does this is it maintains appropriate boundaries. It defines its purpose very clearly. We read that earlier in the presentation. And it constantly sets intentions. So working groups have charters that make it clear what the working group does and what it doesn't do, or its non-goals. Every time anytime anybody gathers, they know why they're there and how the organelle or the group they're a part of is supposed to work. And they have a mission statement to make the internet better. But to do this, they do this by producing high quality, relevant technical engineering documents that influence the way people design, use, and manage the internet. This language is always very intentional. Any of these documents that is an RFC that's come out of the IESG in particular has consensus agreement. It's been looked at by hundreds, if not thousands of eyes. And they adhere to this purpose through open processes, technical competence, a volunteer core, rough consensus and running code, and protocol ownership. The IETF trust owns the copyright on all their things. And this quote was really helpful from Meg Wheatley, that self-organizing systems actually develop coherence in part by really being open to new feedback in their environment. It helps them develop stability and it builds a stronger system. And we see that with what the IETF has built. And if you look at other SDOs who have more closed boundaries, I think they are weaker. These are more wise democracy patterns that we saw present with, the NOMCOM and all the processes for leadership, holistic leadership and governance dynamics, distributed collective intelligence, which is active in the meeting processes, but also all their documentation processes and the pathway from an internet draft to become an RFC. Collective wise oversight of governance. So back to in our report, we have a list of the 7 things we could find that are not open in the IETF. And because everything's so open and well documented, people can gently call out a working group that's going into an area it isn't chartered to be, or a leader who has done something that isn't within their remit in that leadership role. And they do this with grace and ease. There isn't like, there's a way in which things getting slightly out of alignment don't disrupt the whole nervous system. They know how to address it collectively and well. There is a kind of group mind in action. I saw this first when I was watching the birds of a feather happen. Like, should a new group come into the IETF? It's a big question. It's a responsibility for the whole community to hold new work, to move it forward. Is there enough expertise? And so people who want new work to come to the IETF present it to a meeting, a birds of a feather. A lot of people attend and they really scrutinize the work, but they also figure out how to listen to the room and move forward and decide yes or no. They also do this with a format called dispatch, where people think they have work for the IETF and they're like, I don't know where it goes. Which of the 120 working groups does this belong in, right? And they collectively figure it out pretty quickly. These deliberations don't go on for a long time. They figure it out. And there's fundamentally constraints on concentrated power through all this distributed leadership. There is a whole ritual and process to their week-long meetings. We've pulled out some of the patterns from the group work stack here. And the secretariat, which is contracted by the LLC, is the primary host of these meetings. So they are very good at making good space. This is sort of, you can see a microcosm of our Post-it note wall with the patterns that we were identifying around the arc of a meeting. So that's a welcoming and a closing, and there's ritual throughout the time. They literally create the same meeting in different hotels all around the world. There are the same desks. There's a large plenary room, which can be split up into working group meeting rooms. There's usually about 8 breakout rooms. There's always 2 projectors, one for the meeting slides and one for the remote participants to sort of zoom in and present from. And also that has the live transcription of people speaking so that folks who are non-native English speakers can read what people are saying in real time, or folks with other challenges that would be helpful for. On Wednesday evening, they bring the whole system into the room together, literally for 2 hours, with a presentation from all of the core organs about their budgets, the metrics they're tracking. And it's this one chance for the whole to be there. There's open mics with the Internet Architecture Board and with the IESG, so anybody can come to the mic and ask them a question or name something that they're concerned about, and it will be heard by the whole. They also take this opportunity, both within the working groups, to celebrate like a work item achieving RFC status, but also in the plenary, they make space to grieve, both for the protocols that have passed. So this is a poem that Vint Cerf composed in 1989, just before the ARPANET was shut down. And they also grieve people who have passed. When you have the antecedents of the IETF go back to 1969, people pass away. And one of the people in the community I'm most active in, digital identity, passed away, and they put his photo up and they shared about his work. Well, in Prague, last fall. So they're tuned into life. There's transparency and naming and holding space. These are patterns that underlie the whole organization. They're creating space within working groups and within all of the different meetings to to get the work done. They play. This is one of the fun things too, is they are not all serious. There is a whole tradition of April Fool's RFCs that are really fun to read. If you want, you can buy the book of them. And there's an underlying sense of humor about the work and a levity that is there. There is a willingness to experiment and learn, but also to learn how to learn. The community has innovated a whole set of processes and technologies that it continues to improve. The tools team that leads the creation of the data tracker meets the weekend before each IETF to code together and make it better. They also host a hackathon on the weekend beforehand where folks work on implementing the internet draft, implementing code for the internet drafts that they're working on. And they are really grounded in running code, both for the technical protocols, but also for community leadership and governance protocols. So an example of this governance iteration and discernment is I mentioned the dispatch meeting where people come and share 5 minutes about work that they'd like to see within the IETF. And there used to be, or there has been, a tradition of different dispatches for different technical areas in the IETF. And 4 IETFs ago, they said, hey, wait a second, we're seeing people show up at multiple dispatch meetings to present the same work. Why don't we merge them all together and have all dispatch happen so that there's one dispatch meeting and anybody who wants to help direct work to appropriate home can do that together. And they're still running this experiment. They ran it for 2 IETFs. They just posted on the list yesterday. We're going to try it for another one and see how it goes before we decide this is our way forward. So there's a willingness to try new processes, test it out, see how it works, and then if it does work, document it and sort of make that the new norm. They're also willing to abandon old processes that don't work. So if you look at many of the process RFCs within the IETF, it will say obsoleted by this new RFC. And so there's a relationship between the old processes and new processes. They're willing to set aside old work or old processes that no longer serve them. This pattern is also from the social permaculture pattern language. There is a sense when you come to an IETF meeting that you're at a giant work party. People are having a lot of fun doing the work that they're doing and working together with peers. And finally, the IETF, as you may have gleaned, has a somewhat complex identity. And they are self-aware about this. Do you want to close this off, Day, and read this quote?
Well, okay, since I've already started reading the actual text that's on slides, I'll do it again here. The tricky part of describing the IETF process, certainly in the fast-changing world of the internet, is that when you describe the process in too much detail, the IETF loses its flexibility. When you describe it in too little, it becomes unmanageable. This is therefore a slippery subject, hence the name poisson, which is French for fish. The French word also serves to indicate the international aspect of the WG. I thought this was actually kind of funny because they were actually dealing with a serious subject and kind of weaving humor into it. A different version of this, I think, was actually poison, and another one was poised. And I can't remember what the actual acronym stood for, but this was around, originally convened around exactly that set of issues that was such a fundamental part of kind of the identity being forged in the fire. So they were dealing with serious things and holding levity at the same time. So I think that's beautiful. Yeah, and I could say a lot more about the complex identity, but I'll leave it at that.
And finally, we're getting to the close. arguably the internet is one of the most consequential infrastructure commons on the planet. And this tools and infrastructure can be some of the most durable forms of community wealth. The IETF is brimming with this type of community wealth. And it is doing a good job of commenting the commons of the internet, and we encourage folks who are intrigued by what we're sharing to dive in and participate and learn from them. And hopefully some of the communities that are looking to build pro-social technologies like DAOs and other things can learn from not so much the specific things the IETF does, although those are worth looking at and considering for application in your communities, but also how they innovate for themselves. You can't pick up the IETF and cookie cutter. You can learn from it and adopt some of the practices to have your own organization learn and grow. So this is finally just a slide about us, and we'd like to thank our research jury for their support over the summer and making this a success. And I'm going to stop sharing and share in the slide, in the chat, a link to the, I think it will work. Oh, I'll go get it. A link to the Google Docs version, a report that we've written that is an almost complete draft, where you can comment and share more. Oh, yay, Day's got the URL. Thank you. So with that, we'd love to make space to answer any questions that you have.
I noticed that there were a couple questions in the chat. It looked like Day had been getting to them a little bit. If there anything you wanted to address on those questions, Day, any further?
I didn't actually, I mean, I dealt with them sort of in real time, but I didn't really track them in my.
So, Andor has
Open to any current questions would be cool. And if there's people that ask questions that feel still open about them, that'd be great.
This is a good question. Andor asks, I'm curious how long in general it takes for someone to onboard into the IETF process as an effective participant. I think if you have a clear picture of work that you are interested in, that they actively do, you can get onboarded into that working group and its culture pretty quickly. The IETF considers people new participants for the first 4 meetings that they participate in. So that's like a whole year of meetings. I feel that that is true. Like, I feel my next meeting will, if I attend in the fall, will be my 5th meeting. And I feel like I understand how it works and I get it. But it is a bit of a, and I've been paying it a lot of attention, but it's a living, alive organization, and I think that's okay. It has a depth to it because it is so alive. That means it takes a while to figure out. Venkatesh.
Sorry. Yeah, quick question. I think we first interacted in the W3C group you're also part of, and at various times you've sort of like compared the W3C and IETF cultures. And I won't put words in your mouth, but I was wondering if you want to like do the public version of that comparison.
Sure, I think.
Can I just jump in before you do that, Kaliya? And remind you about the important discovery around the context of when it came out, because it actually came out in a specific context that kind of informs some of that difference a little bit.
Sure. So one thing I learned during my research pretty far in, actually, I think after we talked, was the first meeting that Tim Berners-Lee ever went to was that July 1992 meeting, where there was literally a major governance crisis going on within the organization. And I wonder what it would be like if he had showed up a year earlier or showed up a year later when the foment of that governance disruption wasn't happening. But he basically chose to spin the W3C out of the IETF. In fact, the 3 core early web protocols are RFCs within the IETF, and he had a stronger vision of where he wanted it to go and an idea about getting the companies building the web to work together in a consortium more than in a really open process. And up until they created community groups in the W3C, that working groups were closed only to paying members. And so there's just a difference in their willingness to be open to the wider world and get broad feedback because of that. And I know that the W3C right now is doing a lot of reflection about its process and whether it needs to change those processes or, and it's in its own discernment process. So they're different and there are reasons for those differences. And I think, I think in the next 5 years, things will be different again, and we'll see which directions they choose to go in terms of their own processes.
Is it worth commenting briefly on Spice and ActivityPub?
No. Olivero.
Hi, thank you so much. This is very good, very impressive. I've been participating in the IETF for the last 25 years, and I still discover pieces of the process. So, for you to say, well, not just to say, to have shown all the detail that you have shown in really such a short time is very, very impressive. Thank you for that. What I'm really interested in is you characterize what the ATF does in terms of those pattern languages. And the reason I'm here is I've been in the IESG and I'm currently sitting in the IAB actually. And it really interests me the regenerative part that you talk about. Because, just like everything, and it was talked in the chat, what are the incentives to participate, right? No one pays us. We just do it sometimes in the free time or whatever. What are the important patterns that you see that are maybe more important than others that may help the IETF or any organization to keep regenerating itself? As you said, sadly, there's a lot of people who are still participating from 30 years ago.
Yeah.
Sadly, I say because the number of new people who participate is a lot less. So we need to keep this moving for the next, I don't know, however long the internet is going to live, right? So what are those key patterns or key behaviors that you see that will help the IETF keep moving forward?
Jay, do you want to go? I saw you nodding your head.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I riff on it a little bit. I mean, I think the first thing that I thought is when you said, well, what are the key patterns? It's like, well, there was almost no pattern in the GroupWorks deck that we did not find. There was almost no pattern in the Wise Democracy group deck that we did not find. So these decks have already really clearly articulated all of these patterns. And I would say that just like any other living thing, it can't, you could say, oh, DNA is all made by these 4 bases or something like that. Okay, it's just these 4 bases, but it's actually quite a bit more complicated than that in the way that it all interacts and so on. But if I was to have to kind of pick one, it has to do with the very first thing that I said about the epistemology and the theory of knowledge and this core piece of it being emergent and relational. And therefore this quality of staying in an active dance with the real, and that's what makes it a living adaptive system, and that's what keeps it alive. So that means both creating structures and dissolving structures. And if I was to say well, what's you know, it's not the same as it was 50 years ago. But what is the same? Well, the one thing that's the same is that it has been continuously kind of like reinventing itself in various ways. And I think if you see anything that's kind of moving toward too much ossification or too much kind of like stuck in the ways, then in fact, even by making that inquiry, you're demonstrating exactly that quality of self-reflection that's like saying, oh, what is it here that needs some WD-40 on it? What is it here that needs to be liquefied, and we need to inject it with some imaginal cells so that it can reform into something else? And we talk about, you know, some of this kind of like smooth and striated spaces from Deleuze and Guattari and their assemblages. It's like, you know, in the end, this is just all the people that are helping to make this thing whatever it is. It's a self-defining thing. And so I think that core agency around like, we're the ones we've been waiting for, and we're doing this is the we're here to do this work, that I think more than anything else.
Yeah, I think I think talking to the younger people who have chosen to show up and actively engage and understand their why, and the person who really helped me enter the IETF really well is Ori Steele, who's now AD of SEC. So talk, you know, it's like, okay, he's new, he's only been there a few years, and he's like an AD. Okay, why? Like sort of appreciative inquiry about what is working and how to expand those. I think I understand that there was concerns about the aggressive or aggressive culture of the IETF. I think those concerns were probably valid, although I wasn't there to experience them. I think they've gone a long way to kind of figuring out how to maintain their disagreeableness. Like, you can raise issues, you just can't scream at people and call them names. Like, that's not good. Don't do it, right? So the secretariat, I have to say, like, there's a lot of friendliness that it has now that I don't think it had 6 years ago, right? But I also think it has to figure out there's this whole discernment process about the brand of the RFC and how that's determined. That's an active conversation right now that doesn't have a clear answer. Like, what is the process going to be around the independent streams? Could the RFC sort of figure out how sections of Web3 could come into the IETF and participate, and it doesn't just eject them because it's like the new, like, I don't know, but the question you asked is the right one. And I hope this research can help further that dialogue within the IETF, figuring it out.
Thanks so much.
Okay. So somebody asked what to do, how to get engaged. Honestly, I would say show up. Like, I kind of went to the IETF on a whim because it was in my city, and some of the people in my core technical community I focus on digital identity in my work were going to be there. And so I had friends who were there, and communities that I participate in showing up. So I would say show up. It's good to dive in the swimming pool, because then a lot of things make sense if you go to a meeting. Any final thoughts? We're at the top of the hour now. Any final questions? Or there's a hand. Dorian.
Yeah, Dorian's got one.
Yeah, I'm still like, actually, it's funny because this presentation just reminded me that I had a draft outstanding, and I went and uploaded it because I did it just as they shut everything down for 2 weeks before their meeting, and then I forgot about it for a year, so I just did that now. But like, I still do not understand how to get from a draft to an RFC. And like, does it involve going in meetings? Like, do I need to set aside $10,000 a year and go to meetings? Like, is that what I have to do in order to make it happen? Like, I see you nodding.
I'm sort of going like, that is a good question. That's why I'm nodding. I'm not saying yes. I
Oh,
think
okay.
we, in our report in Appendix 1, both talk about things you should do as a new person, because there's like a lot to do, and talk about different pathways to start meaningful work. So I would say read that. We'd love your feedback to see how we've, that specific session, like I have an internet draft, now what, right?
Yeah.
I think they need to work on that. Talk to the appropriate AD, go and look at existing working groups and see if it fits with one of them. Talk to the chairs, like go on YouTube and search for IETF and your topic and see which talks come up, because every meeting within every IETF since they could has been put up on YouTube, right? So it's highly relational. Making friends is a good thing. So finding people who are active IETFers and going, I have this thing. If it's not your particular area, because there's thousands of people in the IETF, who do you think I should go talk to about this?
Yeah.
And
Yeah, just to frame that exact same advice in the negative, I would just say, don't try to navigate it as if it's a bureaucracy. Navigate it as if it's a community.
Okay, that's an interesting way of framing it. Yeah.
okay.
Okay, and Alvaro just said something in the chat about people participating virtually. I mean, like, I guess the thing is, like, all I'm interested in is having my draft become an RFC, like, and moving it past the like re-upping, like changing a word and re-upping it every year when I remember it like that. It's gotta kind of get beyond that. But yeah, anyway, okay.
Also say that the community is relational, social, and reciprocal. So if you want to do work in the IETF, it's good to show up and do work within the IETF, meaning like go and help clear errata, show up and like review other people's drafts and give them meaningful feedback. And they'll be like, oh, wow, maybe we should look at his draft and give him meaningful feedback, right? So you cannot show up at the IETF and go, approve my internet draft. That is a poor strategy. It is good to show up and go, hey, how can I help with things that I'm interested in? And then go, great, I helped you. Can you help me? I've got this thing I'm interested in. And engage with it, like Day said, as if it's a community, not a bureaucracy.
Interesting. Okay, that's a good way of thinking about it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, thanks everyone. I mean, I'm hanging out. People still got burned, but I imagine we're at the top of this, right?
Yeah, and I would say, Dorian, also, it is worth trying to figure out in the coming year when a meeting is close to you. We'll have cheap hotels and like show up and talk to people in person. And then maybe you never have to go again. Like, but you need to build relationship mesh into the organization before the organization will respond to you.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, it's that kind of a thing is the kind of thing I think I need to hear, because it's just kind of and they do a very good job. I mean, like, there's like diagrams on like what the process is, but it's sort of still very sanitized in comparison to like what do I actually have to do, on the ground to make my draft into an RFC.
Yeah. Talk to your AD. Go to dispatch. I mean, that's what I would do. If like it sounds like you have a thing, do a hot RFC, ask to be in dispatch, and dispatch is like literally standing up for 5 minutes going, here's my thing, where does it go? And the wisdom of the group will tell you where to go, and then will support you going there because you asked it where to go.
Okay, guys, we are 5 minutes past the hour, but like this is a great conversation. So take it offline. There's also the unconference next Friday. Seems like a lot of people are interested in the IETF. You guys could do something there. Thanks everybody for showing up tonight. It was a great turnout. We've got a salon tomorrow night by Danielle Butler and Celeste Lecomte, who will be talking about shoreline adaptations to flooding in urban waterways. That's going to be a good one. If everybody can make it. And yeah, thanks Kaliya and Day. Great presentation. Great job.